The Second Year Charity Gala by Independence 16 on AO3. Episode 8, Chapter 4, Flying Rocks. The usual. Hitoshi sighed, reaching up to rub the back of his neck and scratch at the base of his hair where the edge of the gold blonde wig itched his skin. Yaoyorozu hadn't had time to make a wig cap, so he'd been forced to simply shove his natural purple, fluffy hair into the submissive beneath the wig. While he may have had a big, fat crush on Midoriya, he could recognize the other boy's flaws, such as his tendency to throw himself into harm's way for other people without even a second to think. It was an admirable trait. His determination was cute and hot, but it was also very stupid, very often, which was what had set them up in this situation. He was currently hiding behind a wide marble pillar, wearing the disguise Yaoyorozu had morphed out of her hands for him. The few nearby civilians had informed of the plan and made themselves scarce. The only people nearby were Midoriya and Yaoyorozu, huddled together behind the next pillar to his left. Hitoshi glanced over to them every few seconds. Yaoyorozu would poke her head out behind the pillar to keep a close eye on the opening fights, waiting for their moment to strike. That's what she was doing in the moment, leaning forward, her dark hair trailed over her shoulders, with one hand steeping herself onto the smooth marble floor and the other on Midoriya's shoulder beside her. In this position, his view of Midoriya himself was completely unrestricted. The other boy's bright green eyes were fixed on Yaoyorozu's face. He was watching for any signs of the subtle change to indicate that the villains were getting closer. Seemingly aware of Hitoshi's gaze, he looked up just in time to meet his eyes. Midoriya smiled widely, his cute, subtly crooked teeth stretching into a reassuring grin. Hitoshi met it with a small, reluctant upturn of his lips. He had just encouraged Midoriya further. He responded in kind with an enthusiastic thumbs up. Hitoshi's heart lurched. At that moment, however, Yaoyorozu whipped her head back around, tapped Midoriya on the shoulder, and rapidly whispered something to him. He nodded. Not a second later, he'd already leapt up and raced out from behind the pillar to join the fray. There was a hero fighting the liquid quirk villain in front of them. The hero was Karukoman. Hitoshi had never heard of him, but in explaining the plan Midoriya had pointed out, and named each of the heroes on the floor, giving Hitoshi and Yaoyorozu an idea of the weaknesses and strengths of their potential allies. The villain was ushering their quirk to liquefy the area around them to slide away, dodging attacks. Karukoman's speed meant that he was getting occasional hits in, but only light jabs. This certainly frustrated the hero, as Hitoshi noticed his movements become more frantic. Easy to end the fight. It was becoming a battle of endurance, and the villain seemed to be winning. It came to a head when Karukoman attempted a more powerful punch, rendering his arm back to amputate a right hook. The strength he put into the movement slowed him down. However, the villain had time to react. When Karukoman darted forward to hit him, the ground beneath his feet liquefied to mush. Not anticipating this, the hero sank heavily. It reminded Hitoshi of videos of Togatan Senpai's fights during past sports festivals, which Aizawa had made the whole class study earlier in the year, and the ex-student's signature move of facing deep underground only to pop back up a moment later. There was no popping back up for Kirishima, though. The villain took advantage of the hero's surprise by aiming a steel tool boot at his face, where it peaked above the quicksand marble floor. Just before it hit, however, there was a flash of green lightning, and Kirishima was dragged up to stable ground by Midoriya. Midoriya pulled the taller, heavier hero with a hand under each armpit before he deposed him several feet away. Hitoshi saw the villain take one step forward, reconsidering attempting a pursuit, before settling into a wavery battle stance. This gave Midoriya the time to hastily whisper the plan into Kiruman's waiting ears. After a pause, he received a tactical nod, and Midoriya locked eyes with Hitoshi over the hero's head. He took this as the signal to play his part in the plan. He stepped out from behind the pillar. "Hey, Mr. Big Scary Villain Sam," he called in a voice pitched slightly above his normal range. While he had his vocal changer to aid him in fights, he picked up the trick of distinguishing his voice without it. You could never rely too heavily on support items in the field. No hero is a one-trick pony. The voice in the back of his head that sounded a lot like Aizawa reminded him. Hitoshi also took the other efforts to distance this persona from his typical self. He watched the villain with naive eyes, wider than he usually ever opened them, and wiggled his hands in front of him, fiddling with his fingers. He took care to stand up to full height and bounce at the balls of his feet. He waited for a response. What the fuck? The villain looked around confusedly, speaking more to himself and the room as a whole than in response to Hitoshi. Damn it! He needed a direct response. That mental connection. Do you know where the rubbish bins are around here? The large man did a double take, openly staring at him. 'Cause you look like trash. With a roar, the villain ran towards him, shouting, You little... Then he cut out and snapped, eyes vacant and arms hanging loosely to his sides. Hitoshi smirked. Shout, I'm going to destroy you and follow after me, acting as though you're angry. He spun at his heel and walked back to the pillars at the edge of the room. He didn't have to look around to know the villain was following his instructions perfectly. First off, he could feel it through his quirk, and second off, he could hear the enraged shouts and stomping feet approaching. Once they were hidden by the shadows, Hitoshi nixed the command and had the villain stand still, with his arms out. He'd been training with his quirk in the past months, and now non-verbal commands were almost as strong as verbal ones. He tended to stick with vocal commands in the case of mental reassurance, but the villain seemed resigned to his fate, so he was willing to risk it. There was an interesting thing he noted, though. Watching Yaoyorozu dejectedly handcuff the man, the whole disguise had been Midoriya's idea since it was possible the villains had anticipated their quirks. The look of my villain's ease at his commands seemed less like he was a naturally submissive kind of person. Hitoshi could tell this kind of thing through his quirk, along with several other things that made brainwashing certain people an awkward experience, and more like he knew it was futile. So he probably knew Hitoshi's quirk, which meant Midoriya had been right, which didn't surprise Hitoshi in the least. But he felt a rush of pride at how clever his crush/best friend could be, while also being very dumb and oblivious. Yaoyorozu snapped him out of his thoughts with a tap on his arm. What are you thinking about? Is something wrong? Nothing. Don't worry. I just got lost in my head sometimes. Hitoshi reassured her. Oh, I've heard of that being a side effect on some mental quirks. Magne mentioned it during my hero work study. She told him. He shrugged. He heard it before, such as the time his doctor refused to give him any sleeping medications, claiming that his insomnia was probably just a quirk side effect, so the meds would be useless. He was still annoyed about that one. Sure, they may not have helped, but they may have made him feel better about it. Let's just go. He took the lead, the villain trailing after him, with Yaoyorozu bringing up the rear. Their small group crept around the edge of the hall, sticking close to the walls and shadows. They passed several civilians on their way, who Hitoshi not wanted to chunch or bump into the villain. Yaoyorozu had intentionally pitched for them to bring any civilians with them. The idea was dismissed when Hitoshi pointed out that it was too risky to walk around in a large group. They could come back for the civilians once they had a more viable exit. After several tense minutes of light-footed walking, Hitoshi could keep a person brainwashed for up to 2 hours, but it was still nerve-wracking to have people around him who could potentially ruin the whole operation. They reached Monoma. The snarky Class B student was clenching the bloody arm of an injured civilian. Hitoshi recognized her as a manager who approached him and Midoriya earlier. More just Midoriya, really, but he couldn't quite recall her name. Yabisha? Koshi? Monoma flinched at the first sound of footsteps, looking up as they neared to confirm that they weren't hostile. His eyes nearly glanced over Hitoshi, but seemed surprised to see Yaoyorozu. He supposed that he still didn't technically count in on the other boy's mind as Class A stuck up. Like the rest of them, his gaze finally rested on the bound, brainwashed villain with a raised eyebrow and a silent question. Monoma. Hitoshi opened, anticipating that the plan would be better received from him than Yaoyorozu. This villain has a liquefying quirk. We need you to copy it and open the doors. Think you could do that? He intentionally ended with a question, as a little test of his trust. Of course I can. Of course I can. There was no hesitation in Monoma's answer. Hitoshi smirked. He knew that people at UA weren't like his old middle school, but it was always reassuring to be trusted so openly. Monoma knew his quirk. Monoma had used this quirk, in fact, during a recent bout of light-hearted battle training between the two classes. Yet he still responded, and from the matching grin on the other boy's face, it hadn't been on accident. Monoma looked back down at the woman whose arm he was holding. Kokobashi-san, I think the bleeding stopped now. Yaoyorozu can make you some bandages to wrap it up, right? The last part was directed at Yaoyorozu, who nodded and took Monoma's place beside the woman. A bandage effortlessly unraveled from her wrist. How'd she get hurt? Hitoshi asked Monoma quietly, keeping an eye on the woman. Kakibosha. He remembered it now. Flying rocks. The usual. Let's get the show on the road then, huh? Don't hit him. He'll snap out of it. Which we don't want, by the way. He reminded him sarcastically. Monoma's voice was like venom in his reply. Thank you so much for reminding me. I was considering snapping him in the face because I am, in fact, stupid. He rolled his eyes. Perhaps you've been hanging around those idiots in Class 1A too much. He finally stepped towards the villain, brushing his fingers gently across the back of his bound hands. He flinched. Hitoshi assumed that was what always happened when he copied a quirk, since Monoma didn't seem too bothered by it. He immediately tapped the ground with his foot to test out the newfound powers. The marble floor wobbled and liquefied. He quickly pulled his heel out. It stayed liquid. Monoma tapped it again and returned to its solid form, but the surface remained slightly warped. Huh. Interesting. He brushed a hand through his blonde hair and looked back at Yaoyorozu with a snarky grin. Turns out Class B is having to save your asses again, eh? She didn't seem offended. In fact, she sighed in relief. Hitoshi could understand that. The day Monoma stopped being a snarky little shit would be the day they were all well and truly fucked. Get on with it then. Hitoshi retorted, inclining towards the door with his head. Monoma got the message, and after Yaoyorozu left Kiribasha with a few final words of medicated advice, the three of them headed towards the nearest exit, brainwashed villain in tow. It was going well. Too well, of course. A loud crash made Hitoshi falter mid-step and turned to look just in time to see a villain tumbling towards them at top speed. He had just enough time to see Midoriya's oh shit face across the room, where the man had come from before this new villain made impact with the liquefying villain. Okay, alright. Now, this should have been one episode instead of cutting it out in between two episodes. You see, there's this funny little thing called fucking depression. Look, I'm not diagnosed with depression, but February and March happen to be my low year time. Like, I feel shit in those times, which is why I took a break. Like, yeah, I took a couple days break because I needed that. I was actually so absolutely distraught. Like, I have not been able to do a lot of stuff that I actually like. For example, fanfiction, like reading fanfiction, has literally become exhausting. That is when I know I was like, okay, I need to take a break because like doing stuff that I like is starting to become exhausting. And it has nothing to do with podficking, right? I mean, even watching my favorite shows, it's become exhausting. Like, quite literally, I'm getting at that point in time of like, everything I do is a mental strain and it's exhausting. Like, no matter what I do, it's going to be exhausting. Which is understandable. Because, you know, whatever. It's not that bad. Luckily, it was just yesterday. Today seems to be, or not just yesterday, but it was just the past couple days. Today seems to be a good day. I have good days, I have bad days, but, I have my methods. I have my rhythm back. So, I'm all good. You do not have to worry for me. I am taking care of myself. I have been taking care of myself. I just needed to take a break, and I'm splitting this up in half because, look, that's most of the reason why I had to take that break was because the pressure of having to do the 3 daily uploads was absolutely fucking with me. Look, I love posting. I love posting 3 times a day. I love recording these videos. But it could be stressful when I have a time, a time restrict. I envy those who post whenever they post. But I know for a fact that if I post whenever the fuck I want to post, you guys would it would be either one or two. You guys would either have really fucking long videos, and I would overwork myself, and then at times I would underwork myself in the sense of I would go missing for like 2 months, and then I'll come back and post 10 videos a day. Like, as much as the 3 videos a day, it is literally for my own safety. It is for my own safety. And not safety, but like, you get what I mean. Anyways, yeah, as I was reading this, the whole time I was thinking, this is going too well. There has to be, something has to go wrong. But I was also thinking like, oh, well, I mean, this is like the final chapter, or not the final chapter, but the second to last final chapter, so maybe nothing goes wrong, and this is just how they, you know, like, maybe? Foolish to think that. Really. Really foolish to think that. Truly a fool. Anyways, as always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Link to my Discord server and socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.